Well, one thing is certain. Henry Puyi of the 20th century was nothing at all like the early rulers of this dynasty that developed Manchu power outside the Great Wall, conquered the Ming, and made the great Qing Empire, the Da Qingguo, the greatest in the world for a time, and perhaps the greatest in Chinese history. Puyi's ancestors came with fury, cunning, and rather more in the way of organizational administrative talent than had their Mongol predecessors. Though the Manchus were not of the steppe themselves, the Manchu conquest of 1644 was the culmination of the struggle between steppe and zone that Professor Bohl has discussed, between the marauding, conquering tribes north of the wall and the farmers and bureaucrats south of it, at least from a Chinese perspective. The Manchus succeeded over the long haul because they embodied parts of both traditions. They were a nomadic or quasi-nomadic people descended from the Jurchen. They also practiced agriculture. The Manchus had already established a rather effective militarized state in the frontier zone between the wall and what, from a Chinese perspective, would be outer barbarism, a place where Chinese and foreigners traded, intermarried, and where Chinese organizational skills might be brought together with nomadic military power. The Manchus themselves were incredible horsemen and archers, but they had also begun to incorporate Chinese administrators and to make alliances with Chinese generals. They made significant gains of their own on the Manchurian frontier and adopted the dynastic name of the Qing in 1636. Let's stop for a moment and ask, what else happened in 1636? That's right. Harvard University was founded in 1636, the same year that the Qing dynasty was proclaimed, although the Qing would not seize power until 1644. This is a coincidence, as far as I can tell, of absolutely no significance whatsoever. The Manchus were extraordinarily well organized for a frontier people and could be considered barbarians only in the sense that they were in no way literarily distinguished. They had their own writing, but had not fully embraced the written canon of Confucian culture. Manchu warriors and their families were organized in what were called banners, 8 different colors and design variations, as a means of subdividing and controlling this armed population. In the years before the conquest, they created banners of allied Mongols and Chinese, too. It's been written that the banner system is a kind of movable militarized society, led by Manchus, but with important Chinese participation and support. And while the Manchus were organizing outside the wall, the Ming, in effect, was collapsing all by itself, the result of misgovernance, greed, and stupidity on the part of the court of truly historic dimensions. Its demise was speeded by a whole bunch of rebellions and incursions, of which the Manchus were only one. And indeed, it wasn't really, at first, the Manchus, but rather a demented bandit named Li Zicheng who first took Beijing, leading to the emperor's suicide. Now, this guy, Li Zicheng, wanted to establish his own dynasty. There's a story about him. He was said to have been a fine archer, and he wanted to, in some sense, testing his fate, shot an arrow at the character Zhong, Central, for Central Kingdom, with the assumption that if he hits it on, the throne is his to be had. And to everyone's surprise and unease, he missed it. A very bad omen for what would be the first and last emperor of what he called the Shun dynasty. Li did himself no good in his brief rule in the capital. He asked Ming officials there to swear their allegiance to him. And then he executed 46 of the highest of them on the grounds that they were being disloyal to the Ming by siding with him. So how could he possibly trust them? His troops pillaged, whipped, raped the people of Beijing in April of 1644. And 1 month later, the Manchus rode through the Shanhaiguan, the open gate of the Great Wall, in a dust storm, joined the Ming general Wu Sangui to defeat Li Zicheng, the bandit in Beijing, and they entered Beijing. Now, this is an interesting story about how dynasties rise and fall. They were aided very much by this Ming general, Wu Sangui, who was physically in between the Manchus on the outside and Li Zicheng in Beijing, literally and figuratively with his back up against the Great Wall. And the key question for him, this would come around again in the early 20th century when the question would be asked of whom Yuan Shikai would side with in the Republican Revolution. Whom would this general side with? The barbarian invaders who seemed increasingly civilized, or the Chinese militarist who seemed more like a barbarian in the way that he ravaged Beijing? Now, it complicated matters that Li Zicheng had as hostage Wu Sangui's father and other family members. And it also mattered that Li was offering him a large bribe. The Qing, of course, matched the bribe and the titles that he would get. How did he ultimately decide what he decided, which was to let the Manchus in? We don't know, of course, but the most popular story has to do with a woman, the fabulously beautiful Chen Yuan, also known as Chen Yuanyuan. She was Wu Sangui's concubine, and now she was in the hands of the bandit Li Zicheng in Beijing. A famous poem about her and Wu Sangui goes like this. With the slightest tapping of fragrant heels, the 1 inch of scarlet is not stained by spring mud. Silk socks curving and curving, rhythms light and balanced at the top of shoes, returning wet with dew. Drunkenly, she takes off her undersocks with a charming smile. Awakening her love, she says, "Look at them. Aren't they whiter than frost?" Well, now it seems the news came to Wu Sangui that the so-called dashing prince of Li Zicheng's entourage in Beijing had made Chen Yuanyuan his concubine and had violated her. Wu, it is said, was so angry that he decided to do anything to get revenge, even if it meant inviting the Manchus through the Great Wall. Whatever the reason, and he might have had even better ones than Miss Chen Yuanyuan, he did let the Qing in, and at the cost of having his entire household in Beijing, 38 people, slaughtered. His father's head was hung from the Beijing city wall as a warning. What we don't know is what became of his lovely mistress.